thrown off a speeding train into the canyon. A Lakota chief caught her and gave her a second life. The arm that came over the edge of that canyon wall had nothing left in it worth mentioning. I know because I'd used it hard for 53 years, hauling tent poles, steadying rifles, holding grieving women over the graves of their children, and it told me things, that arm. Weight, distance, whether what it was reaching for was alive or gone. She was alive. Barely, but alive is alive. I had come down to that creek before first light, the way I had for 30 years, to sit with what was left of the morning and let it tell me what the day would be. There was ice along the stones in those days, early November, and the Tongue River ran flat and cold and didn't say much. I liked that about it. The creek didn't need me to answer. I heard the train above. I always heard it. The Union Pacific made its run through the canyon pass around 4 in the morning going east. We had watched that train come and go for near 15 years from our camp, long enough that it had become part of the dark, the way thunder becomes part of summer. You stopped counting the seconds between the lightning and the sound. What I had never heard was the scream. Not from inside, from outside, and then the sound of something large hitting the canyon wall about 50 feet up, and then the scrape of it down the rock face, and then the ledge gave a sound like a cracked plank, and then nothing, just the river. I didn't move for 3 counts. Old habit, you listen after a thing happens. The canyon was quiet again. The train had gone around the bend and taken its noise with it. Ice shifted somewhere on the stone. The river didn't change its sound. I left my blanket on the rock and went toward the sound. She was wedged on a narrow shelf about 20 feet below the rim, a shelf I wouldn't have known was there if I hadn't spent years watching the winter birds roost along it. She was face down. One arm hung over the edge and the fingers were moving. That was the thing that told me everything. Fingers moving in the cold before dawn, reaching for something that wasn't there. I went back for the rope I kept with my horse. Her name I learned later, Clara Vesper. She'd been a schoolteacher in Cheyenne before her husband's people sent her east by train with only what she had on her back, and when the man who'd put her there decided that wasn't far enough away, he'd waited until the train crossed the canyon pass and he had thrown her off. That was what she told me 3 days later when she could speak in complete sentences. She said it the way you'd say a road had washed out. Plain. Matter of fact. Like it was something that had happened to someone else, and she was only reporting it. I hadn't asked about any of that when I pulled her up. What I asked was nothing, because she wasn't conscious, and what she needed wasn't questions. She needed warmth, and she needed water, and she needed whoever had set her right shoulder out of its socket to have that corrected before the muscle fixed it wrong. I knew how to do that. My father had taught me when I was 12, showed me on himself, pointed at the joint, said the word for socket in our language, said the word for bone, said set them together like this, you see, and then made me do it twice more before he'd call it learned. He was that way about everything. You didn't leave his teaching until you'd done the thing, not just watched it. I set her shoulder in the dark by the river. She didn't wake up for it. That was mercy. I carried her on my back up the canyon trail to where my horse waited, tied her across the saddle as careful as I could, and rode back to camp. Sun was coming by then, just the edge of it, and my nephew Chayton saw me coming from a quarter mile out and came to meet me at the gate of the camp. He looked at what was on the saddle. He looked at me. He was 20 years old then and had good sense about when to speak and when not to, which is not as common at 20 as it should be, and he didn't ask why. He said, "I'll wake the women." That was what I needed. Her name, I said, was all I knew about her. That and the train and the shelf and the fingers moving. The rest we would learn when we learned it. She slept 2 full days. Not the sleep of someone getting better. The sleep of a body that has been told to stop and is taking the order seriously. I had seen it before in men after battles, in women after fever, in children after the kind of terror that wrings a person out. The body knows when it needs to go away for a while. You let it. You do not prod it back. You keep the fire, keep the water clean, keep the cold out, and you wait. Sitting Bird, who had the medicine knowledge in our camp, did what she did, the poultices for the ribs, which were cracked on the left side judging by the sound of her breathing, the cleaning of the cuts along the woman's face and hands, and the deep one along her right thigh where the rock shelf had opened her. Sitting Bird was 67 years old and had seen enough injury that nothing surprised her anymore. She worked the way she always worked, quickly, without comment, with an efficiency that came from having done hard things for a very long time. When she was done, she washed her hands and said the woman would live if she wanted to, and that was the only diagnosis she gave. She'd been lucky. I'd seen men fall half that distance and break in ways that couldn't be put right. She'd hit the shelf at an angle that had slowed her enough, or the shelf had been wider than it looked from below, or the snow on it had been deep enough to take some of the weight, or something else. I don't know what to call that kind of luck. My people have a word for it that doesn't translate well into English. It means something like, the world was not finished with her yet. On the third morning she opened her eyes. I was the only one in the lodge. Sitting Bird had gone to see to her granddaughter who had a cold, and my nephew was with the horses, which needed checking after the overnight snow. The woman looked at the ceiling of the lodge for a long time. I don't think she knew it was a ceiling at first, knew she was inside anywhere, knew she was anywhere at all, and then she turned her head and she saw me. I said, "You are safe." She looked at me for another count or two without saying anything. Her eyes were working, but the rest of her wasn't. Then she said, "The train." "You are off the train," I said. "You are in our camp. You have been here 3 days." She closed her eyes again. I thought she'd gone back under, but she hadn't. I could see her breathing change, hear her working through it, the way a person works through arithmetic they can't quite get to come out right, checking it again from a different angle. Then she said, "Who caught me?" It wasn't a question, exactly. More like she was saying it to see how the words felt in her mouth. "I did," I said. She didn't say anything to that for a while. When she opened her eyes again, she was looking at the smoke hole in the top of the lodge where the poles came together, and the bit of sky showed through, pale and cold, a square of February gray above the warmth of the fire. "My name is Clara Vesper," she said. "I know," I said. "My nephew found a letter in your coat." "Did you read it?" "No. We put it back." Another long pause. The fire settled. Outside, one of the dogs started and then went quiet again. From the far end of camp came the sound of horses shifting in the cold. "I wasn't sure," she said, "that I wanted to be caught." I thought about that. I sat with it the way I sat with most things, let it settle without pushing it, see where it ended up sitting on its own. "You were reaching," I said. "Your fingers were moving." She turned her head to look at me. She had gray eyes, not the gray of cold things, but the gray of light coming through clouds when the clouds are moving. Moving gray, that's the only way I can put it. Like the color itself wasn't fixed. She said, "Yes." That was the first conversation. It wasn't the last. She stayed because she couldn't travel first. That was the plain truth, and we both understood it, and neither of us pretended otherwise. She had cracked ribs and a healing shoulder and a thigh that would not bear full weight for another 10 days at least, and she had nowhere to go. There was no town within a day's ride that would not have people in it who knew her husband's family. His brother worked for the railroad and had men in several of the stations along the line, and a woman alone and injured was not safe in any of those places. She had no money. She had a coat and a letter she hadn't shown me, and the clothes she'd been thrown off the train in. I told her this without softening it, a week after she'd woken, when she was well enough to sit up and hold a cup. She said, "You're telling me you're the safest place I've got." "For now," I said, "yes." She thought about that. She looked at the cup. She looked at the lodge wall. She was working through it, looking for the angle I'd missed, and I could see when she found that there wasn't one. "All right," she said, "then I'll be useful." I told her to rest. She looked at me the way a person looks at someone who has said something reasonable that they have no intention of listening to. 3 days after she could stand, she was helping Sitting Bird with the cooking fire. 4 days after that, she was learning which roots the old woman wanted from the eastern slope and going to get them, limping slightly but moving. She moved like someone whose ribs were still knitting, careful, deliberate, nothing wasted. No movements she didn't mean, but she moved. She didn't complain about the cold, which was real cold, November cold in the canyon country that got into your bones if you weren't dressed for it. She didn't complain about the food, which was different from what she'd been eating all her life. She sat with the women in the evening and watched what they did with their hands and then tried to do it herself, and when she did it wrong, she watched again and tried again. She had that quality. Stubbornness is the wrong word. It was more like conviction. She had decided something was worth doing, and that decision didn't need to be made twice. My nephew liked her. That was evident from the first week. He brought her things: a better blanket, a pair of moccasins his sister had outgrown, a carved wooden comb. I told him to stop embarrassing himself. He said he wasn't embarrassed. I told him he should be. He grinned in the way that young men grin when they believe they know something about a situation that the older man in front of them does not. I had made that grin myself once. I let it go. What I was watching was something else. What I was watching was whether she was afraid of us. Not the way a stranger is afraid the first night in a place she doesn't know, not the surface fear that comes from unfamiliarity and wears off in a week. Something deeper. Whether she carried in her body the kind of fear that becomes contempt once it feels safe enough to show. I had seen it before: white people who were scared, and then grateful, and then, once the gratitude wore thin and they felt secure, something else came up from underneath, something that looked at my people and saw something lesser. I had watched it happen too many times in too many forms to pretend it wasn't a thing. I didn't want that in my camp. I had enough in this world to carry without adding that to it. She was not afraid, not in that deeper way. Or if she was, she kept it private and didn't let it govern her hands. What she was careful and watchful and honest in the way that people are honest when they've run out of energy to manage a performance. She'd been thrown from a train. She was alive by a margin she didn't fully understand. Something like that strips the performance off a person and leaves what's underneath. And what was underneath Clara Vesper was a woman who paid attention, asked the right questions, and did not think she was owed anything. I watched her for 2 weeks before I spoke to her about anything more than the necessary. We were at the river one evening. She'd come to get water. I was there already, sitting on the flat stone the way I sat most evenings, and neither of us moved to leave. The sun was going down behind the canyon rim and throwing a stripe of orange across the water, the way it did this time of year when the angle was right. She stood with the bucket at her side and watched it without saying anything for a while. She said, "I keep thinking I should be more afraid of you." "Why aren't you?" I said. "Because of the rope," she said. I looked at her. "You went back for a rope," she said. "In the dark, in the cold. You heard something fall and you went to look, and then you went back for a rope before you did anything else. You didn't rush the shelf without the rope like a man who's thinking about himself. You went back." She paused. "A man who thinks before he acts in the cold before dawn, that's not a man who means harm. That's a man who means to get the thing done right." I didn't say anything. "My husband," she said, "never thought before he acted, not once, in 4 years." She picked up the bucket. She walked back toward camp. I watched her go, and the river ran its cold flat run beside me, and the orange light faded off the stone. What she didn't know, what I had no reason yet to tell her, was that the thinking before acting had not come free. I had not always been the man at the river with the rope. There had been a time before this one, before I was the chief my father had made me, before I had learned the full weight of what it meant to have other people's lives inside your decisions. I had been a younger man with a younger man's ideas about what strength meant, The kind of ideas that confuse speed with force, that think reacting quickly is the same as acting well. It had cost me things. A wife I should have listened to better in the years before the last years. A brother whose body we recovered from a skirmish I might have found a way around if I'd thought another day before I moved. A son, but I will not talk about my son yet. I am telling you this the way it happened, which is not in order, because memory is not in order. Memory goes where the pull is strongest, and the pull shifts as you get further from the events and see them differently from the distance. What looks like one story when you are inside, it turns out to be 3 or 4 stories that were running at the same time, and only later do you see how they were woven. My son's name was Lakota. He was 24 when he died. He had his mother's face and my stubbornness, and a laugh that I can still hear clearly if the camp is quiet enough at night, and I let myself listen for it. He died in the winter of 1880, a year before his mother, a fever that moved too fast through the camp and took 6 people in 2 weeks, 2 of them children and Lakota. There is a sequence to grief that I will not describe in detail because anyone who has carried it knows the sequence, and anyone who hasn't doesn't need to know it from me. What I will say is that it changed the shape of what I was. Not in a way that made me lesser, but in the way that fire changes iron. The thing that comes out is not the same as what went in, and some of what was burned away was not worth keeping, and some of it was. The impatience was burned away. The quickness to decide was burned away. The younger man who thought speed was the same as competence. That man was burned away mostly, with a few pieces left that I still catch myself on sometimes, even now. What was left was the man at the river with the rope. The pull in those weeks was toward her. I won't dress it up. I noticed her. The way she moved with those cracked ribs, careful and without complaint. The way she asked questions, not too many, and the ones she asked were the kind that showed she'd been thinking for a while before she opened her mouth. She asked me once, 3 weeks in, what we called the canyon pass in our language. I told her. She tried to say it, and got it wrong in the way that people who haven't been around the sounds get it wrong, putting the emphasis in the English language place. She tried again, got it almost right the second time, close enough that Sitting Bird, who had been listening from across the fire with her back turned as if she were tending to something, made a sound that in our language sits between approval and amusement, a sound the old woman did not make for everyone. Clara looked at the old woman's back. Was that right? Sitting Bird said it back to her, once slowly, the way you repeat something to a child who is learning. Clara said it again. This time it was right, the emphasis correct, the ending sound clean. Sitting Bird nodded once sharply, without turning around, and went back to what she was doing. Clara looked at me. She was trying not to look pleased with herself. She almost succeeded. There was a small thing in the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be. I looked at the fire. There is a kind of warmth that comes into a man who has been cold for a long time and doesn't realize how cold he's been until the warming starts. It doesn't come on all at once. It comes in increments, the way the ground thaws in spring, a softening here, a seam of dark earth showing through the frost there, and then one morning more dark than white, and you understand that the season has turned without your noticing the exact moment it crossed over. That was what was happening to me. I was 53 years old and had been a widower for 11 of them. My wife's name was Winona, and I do not speak it lightly or often, and I will not say it again here because it belongs to a different part of my life that I carry in a different way. She had been the kind of woman who makes a man better simply by the fact of her attention, not by managing him, not by pushing him toward what she wanted him to be, but by looking at him with the expectation that he was capable of the thing in front of him. She had that expectation about everything. The crops, the horses, the treaty talks, the winter, the grief. She looked at hard things the way you look at a problem you intend to solve and already have some ideas about. She died of a fever in the summer of 1881. I was away when it came on. I made it back in time to be there at the end, but not early enough to do anything about the end itself. That is the thing I have never let myself be careless about since, being away when the moment arrives that requires you to be present. I had not looked at a woman since, not that way. I want to be plain about this, because I am telling this the way it happened, and it would not be honest to leave this part out, or to dress it up into something more than what it was. I was not a young man with the kind of heart that flies open at the first warmth that comes near it. I was a man who had carried a great deal for a long time and had arranged himself around the carrying. When Clara Vesper was on that canyon shelf with her fingers moving in the dark, what pulled me toward the rope was not anything like feeling. It was simpler than that. A person was alive and needed what I had in my hands to give. That is all it was in that moment. What happened after was slower, quieter, and mostly I tried not to look at it directly. There was a problem coming, though, that I couldn't avoid looking at. Her husband's brother knew the railroad men at the station in Barrel Creek, which was 18 miles west of our camp, and word had come through my nephew's trading contacts that a woman matching Clara's description was being looked for. Not gently. Her husband, a man named Vincent Falk, who ran horses up from Texas and had a reputation in 2 territories for a temper that ran well ahead of his judgment, was in the area. He'd come north from Cheyenne when he heard she'd survived the fall. That she'd survived at all was, apparently, an inconvenience to him. My nephew brought me this news on a Tuesday morning in early December, standing outside my lodge with his breath making smoke in the cold. He told it straight and then waited. I said, "How many men does Falk travel with?" He said, "They're saying 4, maybe 5. I thought about that. I thought about the camp layout, the sight lines from the ridge, the number of reliable rifles we had. "He'll come here," I said. "Yes," my nephew said. "He'll think she's here because she is here." "Yes." "He'll think he can take her." My nephew was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "Can he?" I looked at him. I looked at him for long enough that he had the sense to look at the ground. "No," I said. I told Clara that evening. I told her plainly, the way I told her everything without softening it, because she was not a woman who needed things softened. I had understood that about her by now. I told her about Falk, about the number of men, about what they likely wanted and what her options were. She sat with it the way she sat with most hard news, which was still and quiet, her hands in her lap, and I could see her turning it over and looking at each side. Then she said, "If I leave now before they come." "Where would you go?" I said. She stopped, thought. "Barrel Creek," she said, "but he has men in the station there." "Yes." "East along the river. The pass is 2 days by horse, and you are not riding distance yet, the thigh." She pressed her lips together. "So I'd make it 1 day and be on foot in the canyon in December." "Yes." She sat with that, then she said, "So you're it." "We are it," I said. "This camp, yes." She looked at me for a moment. "You didn't have to tell me. You could have made the decision yourself, moved me somewhere, hidden me somewhere, and told me after. Most men would have." "You are the one who fell," I said. "You decide where you stand." She looked at the fire. Outside the wind picked up and the lodge wall moved slightly, the way it did when the canyon funneled the air. Chayton was checking the horse line. I could hear his boots in the snow, the particular rhythm of him walking. "I'll stay," she said. We put her in the root cellar 3 days before Falk arrived. Not as punishment and not as hiding, exactly as protection, and she understood the difference and went without argument. The root cellar was under Sitting Bird's lodge, a dugout about 8 feet square lined with stone and earth where we kept the winter stores. Dried venison, dried corn, tubers wrapped in cloth, 2 sealed clay pots of rendered fat. It was cold down there, but not as cold as outside. There was a lamp. There was a pallet. Sitting Bird brought her food and water morning and night, and reportedly, according to my nephew who had this from Sitting Bird's granddaughter, spent those evenings teaching Clara words in our language. drilling her on them the same way she drilled everything, without mercy and without excessive praise. Falk came on a Friday, mid-morning, when the light was flat and the snow had been down 3 days, so the ground was white and clear, and you could see a rider from a long way off. I saw the 5 of them. He'd added a man since the report we'd gotten, coming along the canyon trail from the west. I had been on the ridge since before dawn. I had my rifle across my knees, and Chayton was 40 yards to my left, and 2 other men from our camp were placed further along the tree line with clear sight of the camp below. I let them ride all the way in. Falk came into camp like a man who expected to find what he wanted at the bottom of his hands. He was big, wide through the shoulders, a coat that had cost real money, hat brimmed down against the light. He had a way of looking at things, horses, people, lodges, the faces of the people who'd come out to watch. That said, he was already calculating what they were worth to him. I had seen that look in treaty rooms. The men who wore it thought the calculating was invisible. I came down off the ridge when he was in the center of camp, alone. I left my rifle with Chayton. Falk looked at me. He looked at the camp around him, did a quick count of what he could see. He said, "I'm looking for a white woman, goes by Clara Falk." "Vesper," I said. He stopped. He hadn't expected me to know the name or to correct him with it. I said, "Her name before your family was Vesper. She prefers it." His eyes went narrow. "She's here." "She was," I said. "She left 3 days ago." "Where?" "She didn't say." He looked at me. He was deciding whether I was lying. I held his eyes without effort because I was not lying, not exactly. Clara had left the camp proper 3 days ago when she went down into the root cellar. She had not left here since. One of Falk's men had drifted to the right during the conversation, casual, like a man stretching his legs. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I knew Chayton could see him from the ridge, and Chayton's rifle was on him. Falk said, "You'd tell me the truth, man to man." I looked at him. "She is not your property," I said. "She was thrown off a train. Whoever threw her off is not a man I owe a favor to, and is not a man I will help." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the kind that forms when a man is deciding whether what just happened requires him to do something about it with his hands. I have stood in that silence before. I have stood in it enough times to know what it sounds like when it decides to go one way versus the other. Falk looked around the camp, at the lodges, at the people who had come out and were standing without obviously standing at attention, at the ridge line, where he couldn't see my nephew but where the stillness in the trees told him something was up there. He did the arithmetic. 5 men in a camp of 30, with rifles in places he couldn't fully account for, facing a chief who was not going to move or flinch or give him anything to grab onto. He was good at calculating. He calculated this. He turned his horse. He didn't say anything else. He rode out the way he'd come, his men after him in a line, and we watched them until they cleared the eastern ridge and the sound of hooves in the snow was gone. My nephew came down from the tree line. He was trying not to look pleased. He was 20 years old. He said, "Do you think he'll come back?" "Not here," I said. "He knows what this camp is now. He'll look east. We should get word ahead of him." "Yes," I said, "today." I went and told Sitting Bird it was done. The old woman was already up. She went into the cellar. I waited outside the lodge. Clara came up through the floor door with Sitting Bird's hand on her elbow and blinked at the light. 3 days underground. She was pale, paler than usual, which was saying something, and her hair was loose, and there was root cellar dirt on her sleeve, and she smelled of dried venison and lamp oil. She stood in the cold air of Sitting Bird's lodge and looked at me, and I watched her take one slow breath in and let it all the way out, the way a person exhales something they've been holding. She said, "He's gone." "For now," I said. "We'll get word east ahead of him." She nodded. She looked at the smoke hole for a moment, that square of sky. Then she looked at me. She said, "You told him I left." "I told him you'd gone 3 days ago," I said. "I didn't say where." Something moved in her face that she didn't try to stop. "You kept me here. Hidden in the ground, you kept me here rather than let him take me." "You asked to stay," I said. "I know I did," she said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment, working out what she wanted to say. "You could have given me up, said the woman's upstairs, take her, and saved yourself the trouble of whatever comes next." "There was no trouble," I said. "There will be," she said. "He'll make trouble further down the line." "He'll try," I said. She looked at me. The light in the lodge was the amber light of midday coming through the hide walls, and she stood in it with the loose hair and the dirty sleeve and the lamp oil smell and the gray eyes. She said, "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," I said. "That's not," she stopped, started again. "I've been here 2 months. You fed me, kept me warm, hid me, stood in front of that man without a rifle and told him he couldn't have me. You don't just—" "I heard someone fall," I said. "I got a rope." She stopped. "You owed me nothing from the first moment," I said. "That's not why I did any of it." "Then why?" she said. I thought about how to say it. I am not a man who makes speeches about what he feels. I have the words for it in my own language and fewer of them in English, and sometimes the fewer words are not the wrong number. Sometimes they are the right number. I said, "You were reaching." She remembered. I saw her remember it the first morning, the first conversation, what she'd said. I wasn't sure I wanted to be caught. And what I'd said back, "You were reaching, your fingers were moving." It moved across her face like wind across water, a change in the surface. She pressed her lips together. She was not a woman who cried easily. I had watched for 2 months and she hadn't cried once, not at the pain of her ribs or the shoulder being set or the news about Falk or 3 days alone in a root cellar in the dark. But something was working in her now, something she was deciding what to do with, and the deciding showed. She crossed the lodge. She put her hand on my face, the right hand, the one that had been reaching in the dark over the canyon shelf in the November cold, and she kept it there, warm and still, and she looked at me with those moving cloud eyes and didn't look away. She said, "I want to stay, not because I have nowhere to go. I want to stay because I want to be here." I put my hand over hers. "I will not make more of it than it was." 2 people standing in an amber lodge in December, smelling of venison and lamp oil, an old woman at the far end of the lodge pretending to be busy with something that required no attention, a hand on a face and a hand on a hand, and 2 people who had not said the thing now saying it without needing more words than that. That was all of it. It was enough. It was more than enough. We sent word east through 3 different contacts over the following 10 days. By the time Falk reached the Missouri River stations, he found men who wouldn't help him, and the legal situation in Cheyenne found itself in the hands of a judge who was known to be honest. And I will not bore you with the details of how that came about, except to say that there are favors accumulated over years of fair dealing and straight talk that become available to a man when he needs them. And I needed them. And they were there. The law situation took months. I want to say that plainly because it would be dishonest to make it sound easy. A white woman living in a Lakota camp, a husband with legal standing, money behind him, and a brother in the railroad. There were courts and papers and men who had to be spoken to, and some who could be paid, and some who could not, and some who had their own ideas about what a Lakota chief could, and could not have standing to argue in their territory. It was not fast and it was not clean, and there were weeks in the spring when I didn't know how it would come out and couldn't honestly tell Clara I was sure. She never asked me if I was sure. She said once in April, when a letter came that was not the letter we'd been waiting for, "Are you tired of this?" I said no. She said, "It's a lot to carry." I said, "I've carried more." She looked at me for a moment. "You shouldn't have to carry it on my account." "You're not something I'm carrying," I said. "You're the reason I'm going, that's different." She went back to what she was doing, but I saw what that did to her, and I let it do what it did. My father taught me patience. He said the problem with patience is that people confuse it with waiting, and they are not the same thing. Waiting is passive, you sit still and hope the world moves. Patience is active. Patience means you keep working the problem while you hold steady inside. He said a man who has the right of something must be willing to carry it longer than feels fair, and the length of the carrying is not an argument against the rightness. And the world being slow is not an argument against the world, eventually arriving somewhere true. He was right, he usually was. We were married in the summer of that following year. Not in a church. I had no use for that ceremony and she hadn't asked for it, and the law question had resolved itself by then in a way that made the marriage straightforward. We did it our way, with Sitting Bird and Chayton and the whole camp as witnesses, in the morning when the light was the good light. It was quiet and it was done in an hour, and there was food after and music. And my nephew danced with an enthusiasm that was, as always, significantly greater than his ability, and everyone was kind enough not to say so. Clara wore a dress Sitting Bird had made. She had helped with the beadwork on the hem, each bead placed and checked and often placed again. Sitting Bird had made her do every bead twice before she'd accept it, and they were all hers, every one on the bottom 6 inches of that dress. In the years that followed, she learned the language properly. Not all of it, no one learns all of a language in a few years, but enough to speak plainly with the older women, enough to argue with my nephew about horse sense, which she did often and was usually right about. She took to the work of the camp the way she took to most things, with attention, without complaint, with that quality of hers that was not stubbornness but conviction. She had decided the life was worth doing, and that decision held. She wrote letters to her sister in Ohio. Her sister wrote back, cautious at first and then less cautious, and eventually the sister sent a letter saying she'd like to come visit in the summer, which she did. A thin woman with Clara's gray eyes who arrived on a hired horse from Barrel Creek and spent 2 weeks watching everything around her with an expression of someone who had expected to be afraid and found she wasn't. When she left, she embraced Clara for a long time at the gate of the camp and didn't say much, which was more than enough. There were hard years. A drought year when the hunting was poor and the winter stores ran thin, and we ate less than we should have for 2 months straight. A year when the government men came again with papers, and I spent 3 weeks in a city I did not like, in rooms that smelled of other people's tobacco, sitting across tables from men who wanted things from my people that I was not going to give them. Clara was there for the city part. She sat behind me in those rooms and said nothing, but I could feel her there the way you can feel solid ground underfoot when you have been walking on ice, just the knowledge that it was there, steady. On the last day of the last meeting, when the government man had finally heard what I was not going to concede and had accepted it in the slow way that men accept things they were not expecting, Clara was waiting for me in the corridor outside. She looked at my face. She said, "Did we get what we needed?" "We, not you, we." I said, "We did." She nodded once, the same way Sitting Bird nodded, short and sharp, the thing confirmed. No need for more words. Then she handed me my hat, which I had left inside on the chair, and we walked out together into the street. I have been working toward something in all of this. Let me try to say it. 11 years a widower. 11 years of being the chief, which meant 11 years of other people's weights inside every decision. The hunts, the treaties, the winters, the losses, the times you got it right, and the longer times when you got it wrong but had to absorb the outcome the same. 11 years of being the thing everything pressed against. A rock doesn't get tired in the way a man gets tired, or at least a rock doesn't show it, and I had made myself into something like a rock by sheer accumulation of days, and I had learned to call that strength. And then a woman with moving cloud eyes stood in a lodge smelling of venison and root cellar cold, and put her hand on my face. She didn't do it out of gratitude. She didn't do it out of debt or need or because she had run out of other options. She had her own will. She had been a school teacher. She had walked on bad ribs for 6 weeks without complaining and learned words from an old woman who didn't give them freely. She was a woman who could have found another way if she'd wanted one. She chose this. She chose me, plainly with clear eyes, knowing what she was choosing. There is a thing that only a good woman can give a man when she has her own strength and her own will, and she gives it anyway, freely. It is not the same as gratitude. It is not the same as need. It is something a man who has spent decades being needed learns to recognize the difference from, because the difference matters. Being needed is a weight, even when you are glad to carry it. Being chosen is something else. It finds something in you that you stopped expecting to be found. There is a morning I come back to when I try to put any of this into words for myself. Spring, 2 years after she came down the rope. Early, the way I liked it. I was at the river again, same stone, same flat cold run, the ice long gone by then, cottonwoods leafing out yellow-green, and she came down the trail with 2 cups the way she had started doing when she woke and found my place in the lodge empty. Barefoot on the creek stones, which I had told her twice would bruise her feet and which she had ignored twice, and which I had stopped mentioning because some arguments are not worth the third telling, and because the truth is she never seemed to bruise, or if she did she didn't mention it, which amounts to the same thing. She handed me the cup. She stood beside me, shoulder against my shoulder, looking at the water. Neither of us said anything. The river went its way. The light came up on the canyon wall, that slow orange the stone holds for a few minutes in the early morning before the angle changes and it goes flat. Birds in the cottonwoods, a hawk somewhere above the rim. She said, "This is where you heard me fall." "About 40 yards that way," I said. "Closer to the wall." She looked where I pointed. She was quiet, thinking about it, thinking about the version of this morning where I hadn't been here, or where I had heard the sound and decided it was nothing, a rock shift, an animal, something the dark makes up. She had asked me once what would have happened if I hadn't been at the river that night. I told her I was always at the river that time of morning. She said that wasn't an answer. I said it was the only one I had, and that some questions don't need the answer they're asking for. They need the answer underneath it, which is that it happened the way it happened, and here we are. "I'm glad you came down here that morning," she said. I put my arm around her. She leaned into me, not like someone who needs to be steadied, not like someone who has run out of places to stand, like someone who has chosen the place she is standing in and is standing in it on purpose. There is a difference in the weight of a person when they lean by choice. I cannot explain it precisely. You feel it. The canyon ran with its early light. The cup was warm in my hand. The hawk above the rim made one long circle and then it was gone. And I was a man who had, after a very long cold time, been seen by someone who looked with clear eyes and no debt between us, and had stayed. That is everything I know how to say about it.